Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is the hardy core of the group lasting out through week 3 here. As Hillary said, what I'll do is I will break at our usual time for 2 or 3 minutes, so that way those that want to go home can go home, but I've also heard after last class that there were some requests to go a little longer, so I can stay till 8:30 tonight and continue the discussion. So for those who want to stay, I will stay and run a little longer. But by all means, if you need to get home and you need to get up for work in the morning, I'll break so that you can still do that, or get up and stretch your legs or get a drink. Is this mic okay? I've got the lapel and this. We're good? Okay, everyone can hear all right. Okay. There are some handouts that went around for tonight. Everyone should have 2 of those, and I know that I will not get through all of that, even with the extra part. So apologies to you in advance, but I wanted to at least give it to you anyway, knowing that I wouldn't be able to cover quite all that, because it gives you some directions for further learning, further reading, if you're interested in doing that. So I think it's best for us to continue at the pace we've been going, and you can stop me and ask questions at any time. And if I'm going too slow, you can wave your hands at me and tell me to speed up if it's stuff that's familiar to you, and I can speed up and we'll cover more of that handout. But I think rather than rushing, it's probably better to take the material as it comes, and it's better to get a comprehension of it and then just take what we can in the time that we have. And then there's always more to learn. There's always more to learn. On that note, before I dive into the topics for tonight, I wanted to just first address 2 things, the bibliographies that I've given you. So on the handout from last week, as well as the handout for this week, you'll see I've added to the outline of topics a glossary and a bibliography. So just a few notes on that to provide you with guidance. I didn't have time to annotate the bibliography. Usually for my students in class, I'll give them a longer bibliography and I'll make notes on it to suggest what this book is good for, or what that book is good for, or what level this or that book is at. So a couple of notes on that. From last week's handout, books to point out to you. I think Monsignor Sokolowski's The God of Faith and Reason is a fantastic book. It's not very long. Chapters in the book are only about 10 pages. Now they're slow 10 pages, but it's a short book. It's definitely readable. And I think the first 5 chapters in particular would be really excellent if you could find the time someday to read those. It would complement what we're covering in this course really nicely. He is still teaching. He teaches up the road at Catholic University, Monsignor Sokolowski. I don't know his age. He's got to be in his late 80s by now. He's a man of extraordinary vitality. He still teaches. He doesn't look as old as he is. And he's someone who can get up to a podium like this and say, when I started teaching a CUA 50 years ago, and he'll remember some time before 50 years ago, and he was a junior faculty member. So he's an amazing scholar. That's an amazing book. You should try to find it someday and read at least the first 5 chapters of it. Tavelda's book, the next on the list, that's a tough read, but it's very good. So maybe down the road, that's worth taking a crack at. Mats Wahlberg's book, Revelation as Testimony, he came to the grad school a few years ago and spoke on this book when it just came out. He's from Sweden, so we were lucky to get him. But that book is a very good and I think readable introduction to the whole topic of Revelation that we were talking about last week. And then the last one that I'll highlight is the book by Herbert McCabe, God Matters. I think that's a very readable introduction to many of the topics that we're discussing. So if you're looking for a way in, I'd say McCabe is probably your best way in. This is a collection of essays that he prepared as homilies and parish talks and things of that genre, but he himself is a scholar. So he's giving you kind of a popular type of essay from someone that's very learned. And the first few chapters of that book address the topics that we're covering. So that's a great book to take a look at, and I think you'll find it very readable, Herbert McCabe's God Matters. The glossaries I've given you introduce some of the terminology that I'll be using. Yeah, Pat.
There's a big echo from this, whether it's turned up too loud or something, but I can't understand what you're saying.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else is.
I'm happy to go with or without. I've got the lapel. Has anybody had trouble in past weeks hearing me? No?
It's loud, it's just...
It's echoey, kind of an echoey room. Maybe if I move it a little bit farther away. Is that okay? Okay. Everybody can hear okay? Okay. The glossary on tonight's handout is a little bit longer. If we get through those topics, this will be useful, but even if I don't, maybe it'll be more useful because this will give you some way through. A lot of the literature in the Trinity is complicated just because there are all these new heresies and terms. And if you just get the language down, so much of it starts to drop into place and make sense. So this can be a kind of guide with that. And the second handout from tonight goes into even more detail, but I'll leave that for later. On the bibliography for tonight, I just want to give you a little guidance with those few titles that I put because they're very different from one another, and you wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at the entries. The book you should start with, if you want to read further on the Trinity, is Stephen Bullivant's The Trinity. It's very short, very readable, and it's also kind of an amusing book. He writes it with a sense of humor, but it's very theologically accurate at the same time. So it's a great way to get the basics of the doctrine of the Trinity and some of the historical development. I'd start there. William J. Hill's book at the very end of the list is on the other end of the extreme. Excellent book, but much more complicated. So if you have some theological background from the past, you might find that a really enlightening read, but it's a challenging read. The two books by Father Gilles Emery, translated from the French, the first is the basic introductory book. The second is more technical. They're both excellent, and they're kind of good for different things. The Trinitarian Theology of Thomas Aquinas is the more technical one, and that kind of explains Thomas Aquinas' thought on the Trinity. So useful maybe selectively, or if you have a lot of time. The other book, the Trinity, an introduction, is much shorter, and it's designed to be an introductory textbook that doesn't just focus on technical aspects of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's the historical development, the biblical background, a little bit of everything, and it's written as an introductory textbook. So maybe make a note to yourself. If you're looking for a way in, the way I would triage these is to put Bullivant first, Emery's The Trinity after that, and then maybe actually I'd give them to you right in the very order, the alphabetical order that I listed them. That's probably your best order of reading. So I just wanted to give you that little bit of guidance on those sources. And if anyone has questions afterward, I'm happy to take that up. Now, last week we talked about Revelation. We talked about the role of miracles, and over the last couple of weeks we've distinguished the different senses of belief in God, from belief in miracles, from preliminary faith, from saving faith. We've had occasion to think about what miracles are, and we saw miracles as signs from God that have a distinctive function within revelation. Right? So revelation is divine communication. Right? God communicates with man in order to initiate a relationship with him, a saving relationship. And miracles are part of that whole economy, if you will. It's part of that whole process of God speaking to us, God revealing himself to us. And one of the things that's emerged from the last 2 weeks, I hope, is that revelation and supernatural faith, right, both presuppose belief in God as a starting point. Right? To recognize a miracle, you've got to believe in God as a starting point. Maybe a miracle could trigger a revisitation of the God question. If you didn't believe in God before and you saw a miraculous healing, maybe it would get you to revisit the question of God's existence. But if we look in the scriptures, for example, at the function of miracles, their function is to serve as a sign that some content is from God, that this is God speaking. We looked at the example of the burning bush last week, but you could consider examples from the New Testament too. Christ's healings, verifying his word, verifying his identity as the Son of God. He's doing things and he's speaking in ways that only God can. And why should we take him at his word? Because look at the mighty works that he does. And of course, the greatest of those is his resurrection. So miracles' function then is to authenticate God's word. Right? It shows us that it's God speaking. But again, why should anyone think that a miracle is a miracle rather than just some unexplained phenomenon of physical causality, right? Why think that God is intervening to do this? You first have to have a concept of God being on the table. You have to have an idea that there is a God. And so with that idea, then you can recognize he's the one doing this. Or maybe it's most reasonable to think that God is doing this, as opposed to, I know that we'll be able to explain it someday, right? So one of the things that points up is the importance of having a sound argument for belief in a God. In other words, what are the reasons? What are the philosophical reasons, the natural reasons for believing in a creator, some transcendent being, some source of the world, some source of any contingent thing. And what I want to do with you tonight, to start with, is to look at some of these arguments. And I gave you a handout with a short passage from St. Thomas Aquinas, The Five Ways. Some of you may have heard of this before or read these passages before. And just to recap, St. Thomas was a Dominican from the late 13th century, one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest theologians in the church's history, from the order of preachers. So his mission as a mendicant friar, as no longer a religious life that was bound to a monastery, but someone who would travel, he was a traveling preacher, an itinerant preacher. And to have good preachers, you have to have men who are well-formed and well-educated. So this is why the Dominicans are one of the great intellectual orders in the church, like the Jesuits, right? In the Dominicans' case, their interest in intellectual formation stems from forming people to preach, to be good preachers. So Thomas's vocation as a great intellectual was to form Dominican seminarians, right? Rather, he preached himself, but he was more the formator of the preacher. So he worked behind the scenes. And as I mentioned, the text that this is taken from, the Summa Theologiae, is a basic summary of the whole of Catholic faith designed to form Dominican seminarians. And at the very outset, he gives us these 5 arguments for the existence of God. Now, if you remember last week, I mentioned that in context, these arguments are not meant to be apologetic proofs. So Thomas's task is not what our task today might be if we're arguing with Richard Dawkins or Bertrand Russell or one of the new atheists, right? He's not living in that time period when there is skeptical atheism, right? He's living actually in an age that's defined by its faith. This is the age of the great cathedrals, right? The High Middle Ages, the 13th century, which were not Dark Ages at all, but it was a time when faith and culture were very closely integrated, and you can see this in the art and in the artifacts of that day. It was really a very culturally rich period, especially for the faith. So he didn't have to contend with atheism. That's something that comes centuries later and that we have to deal with today. So the one. He's embarking on this task to write a textbook summary of the whole of Catholic faith. He wants to talk about who God is and what God is and how to understand the whole of reality under the aspect of God. But to start that project, he first has to establish that God is. So after considering what sacred doctrine is in the very first question of the Summa, in the second question, where we are, his task is to establish that there's a God. And with that out of the way, then he can go on to do the many thousands of pages of work that he goes on to do. He never actually completes it. He dies before completing the Summa Theologiae. But it's a massive undertaking. So that's where we are, and that's the purpose of it. Now, this doesn't mean that the arguments don't prove God's existence or that the arguments can't be used within the context of apologetics. But it does mean that we are probably going to need to do a little bit more work with the arguments to elaborate them in a satisfactory way for a modern audience. And as I mentioned to you, there are some books that do that at great lengths, even on the bibliography. The book by Grisey, God, A Philosophical Preface to Faith, is over 400 pages, and it's basically a version of the third way, just one of the 5 ways. So that's an example of how you can take the basic idea and elaborate it, responding to the objections of Hume and all of the modern philosophers, right? Kant. So I'm not going to attempt to do that with you tonight, but I do want to walk you through at least 3 of the 5 ways, because while the first 1 or 2 are pretty straightforward, I think the third is more complex, but the third is a very powerful argument. So I want to look at how that argument runs, and then I want to see what that reveals about who God is, and then see where that leaves us with the time that we have. So I want to show you how these arguments work, because I think they're very powerful arguments. And the situation that we contend with today very often is that people who are skeptical are led off the hook too easily, right? No one ever really holds them to account with the God question. And I think if we understand the reasons for belief in a God, the reasons for belief in a creator, besides what the scriptures tell us, besides what our faith tells us, but just what are the natural philosophical reasons for belief in a God, that can establish some of those preambles that we talked about, the preambles to faith, which are the necessary starting points for someone who doesn't have faith to come to have it. Because remember, faith is this gradual, rational process, Grace is always at work. It's always God intervening, supernaturally when someone comes to faith. But it doesn't happen out of the blue. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen apart from reason. So in order to lead people to faith, we have to be able to give an accounting of the first stepping stones that lead one there. And of course, hopefully for us too, that helps to strengthen our faith, because then we're understanding our faith better. Even if we're already convinced, we can hold on to that faith with greater strength. So let's begin to look through some of the arguments that Thomas gives us. And before we go into the 5 ways, I just want to do the first 3 with you. I want to look at the first couple of articles, and maybe, can I just see a show of hands? And it's not, it wasn't homework, so if you didn't read it, it's okay. How many people did get a chance to look at this handout? Anybody read this, just so I know how familiar you are with it? Okay, so a few of you did. Many of you didn't. It's a busy week, so I won't assume too much reading this, but let me summarize for you the first 2 articles, and then the 5 ways come in Article 3, so that we get the context. I'm going to summarize the first 2. You can see, if you have the handout with you, that in Article 1, it centers on this question. Is the existence of God self-evident? Right? Is the existence of God self-evident? And Thomas's reply to that, does anyone know? Or how would you answer this question? If someone asked you if the existence of God is self-evident, how would you reply to that? To many people around us today, it doesn't appear to be self-evident, right? And Thomas kind of agrees with them, right? He says, it's not really self-evident to us. He says, it is and it isn't. I mean, this is a classical move of Thomas. So if you've read any Aquinas, or if you started to read the handout, a classical medieval scholastic move is to not say yes or no, it's to distinguish, and then to say yes or no. Invoke a distinction, clarify what you mean. So is the existence of God self-evident? He says, well, kind of yes and kind of no. You have to make a distinction. Yes, it's self-evident in itself. In other words, if you knew what it was to be God, if you knew what God's nature was, then it would be self-evident that he exists. We'll get to the reasons why later, but for starters, God can't not exist, right? No one made God. So if you knew what it was to be God, right, you would know that he exists, because God exists necessarily. But the trouble is this. God's existence might be self-evident if you had God's own wisdom. But if you're in our position down here in the world as a finite creature, surrounded with the items of sense experience, God's existence isn't self-evident. It might be more or less evident to you depending on your moral dispositions, depending on your life circumstances, but it's not strictly self-evident. It's not self-evident, for example, in the way that all bachelors are unmarried, right, is a self-evident truth. Right? Something like that is self-evident because the predicate is contained in the subject, right? Just what it is to be a bachelor includes being unmarried, right? You could come up with other examples like this, right, of logically necessary truths. Those things are very clearly self-evident. He says if you knew what God was, like the way you know what a bachelor is, then you'd know that he has to exist, just like you know a bachelor has to be unmarried. The trouble is, you don't know what God is in himself, because God is not one of the items that you see, taste, touch, smell, that you have that direct sensory experience of, like the articles in the world, the items in the world. So he says, well, he kind of is self-evident and kind of isn't. To God himself, clearly it's self-evident. To the wise, he's self-evident, but to us, he's not. Thomas distinguishes 2 ways that a thing can be self-evident. He says a thing can be self-evident to the wise, or it could be self-evident in itself. God's existence in itself is self-evident, but that doesn't mean that it's self-evident to everyone, right? So to know that some claim like that God exists, or that bachelors are unmarried, to know that it's self-evident, you've got to know the meanings of the terms, right? If you don't know what bachelors are, if you don't know what marriage is, even something as obvious to us as that, bachelors are unmarried, that's not going to be clear to you either, right? So you've got to know the meanings of the terms. The problem here is we don't know the nature of God, okay? So what does that mean for us? Well, it means that we have to undertake a different kind of argument than the argument that St. Anselm gave us. Does anyone know, has anyone ever heard of the argument that St. Anselm gave us for the existence of God? Yeah. How does that run? Do you remember? It's kind of a tongue twister.
Yeah, it's like God is something that there's nothing that can be conceived of which is greater than it.
Yeah.
To exist is greater than not to exist, so therefore God exists.
Yeah, exactly. So he's got this classic phrase, God is that than which nothing greater could be thought. And I think Thomas actually unpacks this in Article 1. I'm not going to take the time to comb through the text, but basically what you said, right? God is the greatest conceivable thing, and if you could conceive of him but then imagine him not being, then you haven't really conceived of him, because being is a perfection, and something that has all the same attributes but also exists would be greater than the thing you thought of. So you can't imagine God, you can't think of God not existing. So this is a purely logical, formal argument. Sorry for all the details, I don't mean to lose you on this. But think of it this way, it's like the bachelors are unmarried kind of move, right? It's to say, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. You imagine this supreme being with all the perfections imaginable, right? That's God, says Anselm. And then you argue back to Anselm and you say, well, okay, I can imagine that being, but that doesn't mean he's there. And he says, no. If you can imagine that being and he's not there, then you haven't imagined him. You haven't conceptualized, I shouldn't say imagine, you haven't conceptualized him properly. Because you've conceptualized something with all the perfections there are minus one, which is actual existence. So you have to always have that perfection in there. And so he's got this logical, he's got you kind of in this logical headlock, right? Where you can't get out of it. And he says, well, you've got to admit that God exists, because God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. And if he's really that than which nothing greater can be thought, his existence has to include his being, his necessary being. Well, again, Thomas says that doesn't quite work. And the reason it doesn't work is that, A, we don't know God's essence. We don't have a comprehension of what God is in himself. And two, even if we have this concept of God as being a necessary being, at the end of the day, all we're left with is an idea of God. We haven't actually established that he exists outside of our thinking. Okay, so I just want to go through that as a ground clearing exercise, right? So this is the flaw that St. Thomas spots in St. Anselm's classical argument, the that than which nothing greater can be thought argument, right? He says, okay, you've got this definition of God, even maybe a good one, a definition of God that includes God's necessary being. But at the end of the day, you're still left with nothing more than a definition. All you've got is God in my mind, God in my thinking. But you haven't established that what you've conceptualized exists out there, outside of your mind, outside of your thinking. So Thomas says we have to take a different approach. We can't just start with a definition of God and conclude to his existence. We have to actually look at the world around us. And this is the way that the 5 ways work, right? So Thomas is a good teacher, and notice the way that he's teaching. He's starting with what's most obvious to us, and he's working his way up gradually to what's less obvious. So he's starting with what's closest to the mind, the things of our experience, starting with what's better known, and he's working to what's lesser known. Okay, so his arguments, sometimes you'll see the terminology. The terminology isn't super important, but if you've ever seen these terms, just so you know what they mean, a priori and a posteriori. Has anyone ever seen that before? Some people? Yeah, so what this basically means, an a priori proof is starting with a definition, like Anselm. A posteriori is post-experience, starting with your sense experience of the world, starting with what's obvious, and then slowly ascending up to what's less obvious. That's St. Thomas's approach. I think you can see this even within the 5 ways. So I'm not going to go through all 5, but I do want to go through 3, but just so we have the sense for the whole. Can anyone tell me, do you know, what are the 5 ways? Can you think of any off the top of your head, those of you who might be familiar with them before? Any of the names for these arguments? In fact, I think I put them on the... Okay, the first mover. So there's the argument from motion, okay, and that's the very first argument that he makes, right, the first way. What's another way of the 5? Yeah, for the first cause, right, the argument from causation, or from efficient causation, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. So we've got the argument from motion, the argument from causation, efficient causation. It's another way. They get harder from there, yeah.
Not having infinite
Yes, that's a key part of all the arguments. We're going to look at that. So the inadmissibility of an infinite regress in the arguments is crucial for making the argument run. So we're going to look at why that is as we go on. It's like writing a check that has an unlimited number of endorsement signatures, right? You can never actually cash it, right? That's the problem with those arguments. The other ones are from contingency and necessity. So we'll get clear on what that is. An argument, the fourth argument is from gradations in perfection in nature, different degrees of perfection. And the fifth argument is from teleology, or goal-directedness in nature. The fact that things seem to act for a purpose. Ducks fly south in the winter, not north. That keeps them alive. Right? There's all kinds of purpose written in the world throughout us. Where does that purpose come from? Where does that goal-directed action come from in things that lack intelligence? Right? If you just look at the natural world, it's as if things have mind, which clearly don't have mind. And people have puzzled over this for millennia, right? The ancient Greeks puzzled over that. Aristotle would ask the question, why is it you can plant a seed or an acorn and it does this amazing thing and it's very regular, it always becomes an oak tree, but you can't take your bedpost and plant it. It doesn't grow into a tree, but it's the same material. What's the difference, right? It sounds like kind of a silly question, but he's getting at something that's really significant. There's some kind of, if you will, we could call it like software, written into these inanimate things that makes them act in a certain kind of a way. Well, where does that software come from? Where does that goal-directedness come from? It's really a marvel when you think about it. And this is kind of what drives modern science, right? Science investigates nature. There wouldn't be anything there worth investigating if this weren't true about the world. But where does it come from? Where does that goal-directedness come from? Sometimes that argument is confused with the argument from design. It's in some ways similar to it and in some ways different from it. But we'll leave that aside for now. I want to look with you tonight at the first three ways. And the first thing to notice about this is that method, starting with what's more obvious and going to what's less, is exactly the method that seems to characterize the five ways, especially the first three. One thing that's really obvious as you look at these arguments is that they seem very similar one to another. You brought up the topic of infinite regress, and that's a feature, a key feature of each of those arguments. It seems like Thomas is almost like arguing in a concentric way, like a cyclone. He's starting up here, but then he's kind of drilling down, he's locking down the argument and he's getting tighter. And I think what you see going on is he's starting with a kind of argument that starts with very obvious phenomenon, motion. And for Thomas, motion doesn't just mean like this kind of motion, like local physical motion. He means change. So there could be different kinds of change than something going from here to there. It could change in quality, quantity, right? My glass could get more full versus less full. The water in my glass could get cooler or hotter. Those are all kinds of motion for Thomas. It's just change. And of course, motion in space, local motion, that's also a kind of change. So he's considering change in general. And that's a good place to start, because if there's anything that's obvious about the world around us, especially in this area, right, it's that things are changing all the time. So he starts with something that's very obvious to our sense experience. And then he's trying to get to what's less obvious, the existence of God. The same basic move that's in that argument is also at work in the second way, where he's talking about causes and effects, and the third way, where he's talking about contingency and necessity. But you can already just tell from listening to me describe these arguments in brief that he goes from what's very obvious to something that sounds very abstract and very abstruse, and you're not quite sure, what is this argument from contingency and necessity? What do the terms even mean? He's making the same basic point, but he's starting with what's obvious, and he's kind of narrowly drilling down to getting to an argument that's very tight and very probative from a philosophical standpoint, but which is maybe hard to start from, right? And that's the third way. So that's where I want to end up with you tonight. Okay, so let's just take a look at the arguments. If you have the handout together, I'm on the third page of the handout, where on the left column he says, I answer that. And you get all five ways in that paragraph, or those 5 paragraphs that follow. Okay, so let's just look at this passage together. The first and most manifest way is the argument from motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, for nothing can be in motion except what is in potentiality to that toward which it is in motion. whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is an act. That's the key phrase. So, takeaway point 1 here. When he's talking about motion, he's talking about change. And when he's talking about change, what he's supposing is a framework of looking at reality where there's potentiality and actuality. And he doesn't mean anything loaded by those terms. He means the exact same thing we would mean. Like if you talk to an employee or your child and you say, you have a lot of potential, right? You have a lot of ability to do something, right? And you can tap into that and make something happen, right? That's exactly the sort of thing Thomas means. Potency and act. So by potency, he means something's capability for being more than what it is at present. And actuality is the kind of unloading of potentiality. It's the full flowering. You can think of many common examples of this, right? From going from potency to act. The water in my glass was cold. It had the capacity to get warm, and so it's getting warm. But why is it getting warm, right? What explains it? It doesn't just happen. The change is evident. I can feel the warmth. But why does it go from potentially warm to actually warm? Only if there's something that is actually warm that's influencing it, right? You've got to have warm air in the room or a fire, not under a plastic cup, but a heater, right, making it warmer. So this is really obvious. I don't mean to belabor the point, but the key takeaway is that change is, you can always analyze change in terms of potency and actuality. Right? You can't make any sense of any kind of change in the world unless you go from a starting point where a thing could be other than it is, and then an ending point where it actually has become different. And the question that we're trying to get at is what brings about that change? Because Thomas's supposition is that never just kind of happens on its own. Anytime one thing changes its state from one way of being to another way of being, there's a changer involved. And to the infinite regress problem, right, you could say, well, what changed it was the warm air in the room. And then you say, well, what made the air warm? Because it has the potentiality to be cool, but it was warm. It was cool last night, and today it's been made warm. Well, someone turned on the thermostat. Well, what did the thermostat do? Well, it triggered the furnace. And what did the furnace do? Well, it realized the locked-in potentialities of natural gas, and it ignited the natural gas. And it chemically released potency. We're in the chemical bonds of the natural gas. And you could go on and on and on and give a very elaborate story about changed changers that bring about some final change that you started from. And Thomas's point is, however long and however complex that argument is, it has to end somewhere. It has to bottom out somewhere, because if it doesn't, you have no explanation at all for the very common, ordinary change that you started from. I have no way to explain, really, at the end of the day, why the water in my glass got warmer if I can't finally ground this argument. Now, it's not that it isn't worth giving a partial argument. Again, to make the comparison to natural science, that's what scientists' job is. It's to give an account of changes that are observable in terms of known causes that we can observe from our experience. And that's fine. That's an important thing to do. And the more elaborate that story becomes, the more we've unlocked the secrets of nature, the more that we know our world. But it doesn't give us any ultimate explanation for the world. Or, more accurately, it doesn't give us any ultimate account of why any one thing that we started from in the world is the way it is instead of otherwise. So again, like to use the bank check analogy, it's as if someone gave you a check, right, and told you, go cash this check, but you have to get these signatures, and there's a unlimited number of signature lines. We could never actually cash the thing, right? It's that kind of an argument. It's no argument at all if it doesn't bottom out somewhere. So that's why an infinite regress is inadmissible. If you think that it makes sense to be able to explain why any change happens, in order to have an explanation, the argument has to stop. So Thomas says you have to have an unmoved mover or an unchanged changer. And something else important about this unchanged changer, in order to take something that's in potency and put it into act, the thing that accounts for that change itself has to be in act. Right? It has to sort of be of a higher level of actuality. So to use mundane examples, in the furnace, the gas comes through the pipes, but what gets the gas burning? Right? Something, a spark, a flame, a pilot light. It's already on fire. It's already in act, and that unlocks the potentialities of the unburned gas. What makes the water in my glass warmer? the air in the room that's already warmer than the water, right? So there's already, the air that does the warming is already in act. If you go to a blacksmith shop, what makes the iron white hot? It's the fire, which already has heat that, transmits its heat into the iron and turns it white hot so it can be shaped. So the principle at work here is that anytime you have a change, you have to have a changer. And in order for the changer to be a changer, it has to have actuality. You can't give what you don't have. Now, that doesn't sound like a description of God, like maybe we get in the Old Testament or in the New Testament in the Old Testament. But what it does give you is some entity at the very beginning that accounts for the changes that we see. And we know that this being must be an act, right? It can't be in potency. It can't be something subject to change. It has to be unchanged and purely actual. That leaves a lot of questions open, and it doesn't give us a very sharply defined idea of a personal God, but it does give us the existence, undeniably, of some entity that can bring about action in the world. The significance of that, I hope, becomes clear as we go through the next two articles, because we're talking about changes that are very evident to our senses, like temperature changes and things like that. But consider that this is also a kind of change. In the natural world, some things are generated and corrupt, right, living things. Plants go through a life cycle. They decay and they die. Animals do the same thing. We do the same thing, right, organically, right? Some things come into being and pass out of being. So change is not only going from one state to another state, like my water still remaining water, but getting, more or less warm, or there being more or less of the water in the cup. One kind of change that we have to deal with is from being to non-being, dying, or from non-being to being, new organisms being generated or conceived or germinating in the soil, right? How do we account for that? Ultimately, how do we account for existence itself? How do we go from the change from non-existence to existence? That's not the most obvious question to our senses, but that is kind of the foundational question. And so you can start to see how this first argument begins to move us in the direction of a being that can account for the existence of things. The second argument is from efficient causation. And the structure of the argument is very similar, so I won't rehearse the structure. But the idea is this. Anytime you've got some phenomenon, some change, let's say, not only do you have to have the mover, but you could analyze that change in terms of causality. Now, there's different kinds of causes, different ways of causing. And what Thomas is taking for granted here are the four causes. Has anyone ever heard of the four causes in this group from Aristotle? Do you know what are the four causes? Can you remember them?
I guess there's like the formal cause, there's like the material cause, there's like the teleological.
Final cause, yep. Mm-hmm.
That's probably
The last one is the efficient cause, the one that we're going to talk about. Good. So, so there's different ways that a thing can be brought about. There's different ways that some effect can happen. And this is from Aristotle. Thomas takes it on board. And what we're interested in is efficient causality. But I just want to give you a sense for what that is by explaining what it isn't. So there are four causes in Aristotle's view. And Thomas agrees with him on this. Four ways of talking about how effects get brought about. And here they are. You can just use an example like a statue. In the church, there's probably a good statue we could point to. There's not one here, but think of a statue, okay? The four causes that you just named are the formal cause, the final cause, the material cause, and the efficient cause. So what are these? Start with the material cause. If you have a statue, right, the material cause of the statue is the stuff it's made out of. It's funny to think about that as a cause, because the stuff doesn't do the making. It's the sculptor that does the making. But you wouldn't have the statue without the stuff, right? Without the clay or the bronze. So you've got to admit that the clay or the bronze in some way causes the statue to be there. But it causes it in a merely material way, right? You might say it's in potency, to use the potency and act analogy that I brought up earlier. Like think of Michelangelo, right? Didn't he used to say that he could look at a block of marble and he could see the statue in it, and he was like unleashing the statue from the marble. It's like he had that ability to just see the potency. That's a good example of potency in act, right? You've got the slab of raw material, which is potency, right? And the finished pietà, right? That's actuality. And what Michelangelo's task with the chisel is to kind of unleash the hidden potentialities of that block of raw material. So the marble is the material cause, okay? The formal cause, right? The formal cause, if you will, is the shape, right? In this case, if you take an artistic artifact like the Pietà, the formal cause are the dimensions, right? I just saw a program, I was traveling this past week, I was stuck at the airport watching whatever they had on at the airport. They now have a machine, this is almost terrible, they have a machine that can recreate classical art to a T, digitally, robotically, like with no effort other than the programming. I mean, it's an amazing feat to create the machine that can do it, but they were sculpting a Pietà, and it was a robot doing it. And the way that they did this is a good illustration for us of formal causality. Some of you are probably engineers or mathematicians. You can analyze the material world in terms of number, right, to a large degree. You can take the Pietà, it almost seems vulgar to do this, but you can take the Pietà and analyze it in number, right? You can give it quantitative dimensions down to a T, you know, give X, Y coordinates, right? And if you do this, as we now are doing, you can program that into a machine and recreate the Pietà. Not quite the same, but there it is. You can't tell the difference when you look at it. So the formal cause is that kind of shape, if you will. It's not material at all. It's this kind of abstract, in this case mathematizable, structure. Maybe structure is a good word for form. Form does a lot of work in nature, right? It's that hidden software that makes things tick the way that they tick. But that's a cause, right? What makes the marble to be the Pietà in some way, undeniably, is the shape, the form, the structure that makes this to look like Mary and this to look like Jesus and not to look like something else, right? So that's the formal cause. Again, it's not the agent doing the action, but it is something that makes the Pietà to be there instead of not be there. The form actualizes the matter, right? Before you have just the slab of marble, it's potency, but by imposing form, however you get form into it, or however you draw form out of it, that's how you go from potency to act, right? So the structure or the form actualizes those hidden potentialities of that block of uncarved marble. Those are two of our causes. Third cause is the final cause. You mentioned the telos, the teleology, the end-directedness. There's some purpose for this, right? Not only do you have the matter and the form, but you have the why. Why would anybody do this? Why would form ever be imposed on this matter in this way? What was the motivation for carving the sculpture? Was it for the sake of beauty? Was it for the sake of piety and devotion? Why was it done? So there's always an end that's explaining an action. That's the final cause. But at the end of the day, you also have the efficient cause. And efficient cause just means like an agent cause. So you have Michelangelo, you have the sculptor. If it's the water getting heated, you have the fire underneath the water that's making it get warmer. So this is an agent cause, an efficient cause. And Thomas's second argument is looking at this question of causality. You start with some effect. Why did that effect happen? You point to an efficient cause. And you say, well, that cause brought about this effect. You know, Michelangelo chipped away at the statue. Maybe Michelangelo's chisel chipped away at it. Well, what made his chisel work? His hammer did. What made his hammer work? He did. What made him work, right? You could give it a physical account of his muscles and his nervous system and all of the, right? You could go on and on and on. You can't go on forever in the order of efficient causes, because if you did, you'd have no explanation at all at the end of the day for this effect, which seems we should be able to explain. We still have a lingering question. Why do we think we should be able to explain it? Right? Why do we think that's a legitimate question? We're going to get to that in the next stage. But that's argument number two. It's like argument one in its form, but now instead of talking about potentiality and actuality, change, we're now looking at the problem in terms of causation, efficient causation. And Thomas again is saying you can't have an infinite regress. So if you start with some item in your experience, you say, well, why is it there rather than not? Well, you have to have a first cause. Now again, that's not a very fleshed out definition of God, but it is someone who accounts for the being of things, right? It sounds like a creator. It's not very fleshed out, but it is some kind of higher being that accounts for the, why the world is rather than not. Now, the lingering question is, why do we think that these things need explanation anyway? Some things just kind of strike us as obviously needing explanation, but if you really push it, you could raise a legitimate question. You know, why don't you just suppose that the world is this way, or that this item in the world couldn't be otherwise, or that motion just happens, change just happens? This gets to the bottom of matters, I think, and it comes up in the third way. Here, Thomas is asking about contingency and necessity. And the way he's using those terms is this way. Something that's contingent could be otherwise, could not be, right? If it's contingent, it could not happen, it could not be. Just like we say, my travel plans might be contingent if I get stuck in traffic on the way here, right? So it could not be. Something that's necessary cannot not be, right? It must be. So there's that contrast between necessity and contingency. Now, I want to actually look at this argument carefully with you because it's a little more complicated than the other ones, and it's easy to miss what's really going on in the argument. But I think what's really happening is Thomas is drilling down on that most fundamental issue that's behind it all. The question of the contingency of the world, or the contingency of any item in our experience, even the things that seem to us maybe to be the most permanent. Thomas kind of gets behind that permanency and that necessity. Let's look at how he does it. So I'm at the bottom of that left-hand column on the same page we looked at a moment ago. And first I just want to read through the argument with you. The third way is taken from possibility and necessity, and it runs thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be, since they're found to be generated and to corrupt. And consequently, they are possible to be and not be. Okay, so far straightforward, right? He's saying, if you look around at the world, there are some things that are generated, living things, and that die. Generation and corruption, plants and animals. So, clearly not everything is necessary, right? Some things clearly come into being and go out of being. It's impossible for these to always exist, for that which is possible not to be at some time is not. Now, that's a puzzling argument maybe, right? He says, if a thing is able to not be, things that are of the sort that can not be, I'm sorry, it's hard at 8 o'clock at night during the week, the things that can not be, sometimes must not be. You think, well, why, Thomas? Why not just say that they could not be, but they just maybe always are, even though they could not be, it's an unrealized possibility. Here's what's going on, I think, and it's easy to miss this because it's not stated. Thomas is very realistic about possibility. He doesn't live in this abstract world of pure hypotheticals. For Thomas, if something is possible, it means sometimes it actually occurs. Because if it never occurs, you don't have any basis for saying that it's possible. So Thomas is very concrete. He's very realistic about possibility. There are no pure hypotheticals for him, right? So if a thing can not be, that means sometimes it does not be, right? That's the basic takeaway there. Yeah, there's a question.
When Thomas says that an object is found to be generated and to corrupt, does he mean that it corrupts other things or becomes corrupt?
It becomes corrupt itself. Yeah, good question. Yep. So it's a translation. It's a little bit awkward. He means things that come into being and pass out of being. It's like plants and animals, basically. So we see things like that in nature. And we know that not everything can be like that because all those things, things of that kind, all of them at some time are not. Otherwise, we wouldn't say that they're contingent, right? We'd say that they must sometime not be. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. That's taking that same realism about possibility a step further. That's a tricky move to follow, right? But he's saying, first, again, if a thing cannot be, sometimes it's not, okay? And then secondly, if everything were like that, then it's possible that sometimes there's nothing. And again, remember, he's a realist, so if it's possible that there be nothing, then at some time there's nothing, right? So you've got, if the whole world is made up of stuff that is contingent, could come into being or go out of being, then you've got no starting point at all, right, for the world. And that's what he says in the very next line. If this were true, even now there'd be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist, and thus even now, nothing would be in existence. That's a way of bringing the argument full circle to say what we just said together a moment ago. If things can be or not be, if they have it in their nature to not be, sometimes they're not. And if everything's like that, if the whole set of everything there is that they could not be, then it's logically possible that that non-being coincides in every instance, right? And you have a world with nothing. Well, if that's possible, then that's got to happen at some time to be really possible. So you've got a completely nil world. You've got no world at all. And if you've got completely nil, you can't go from that to something without a starting principle. So he says, we see that there are contingent things, but we know not everything could be contingent because otherwise this would all be a fiction. And we know it's not a fiction. Yeah?
How we know that all things cannot be?
Yeah, so how do we know that all things cannot be? That's an excellent question, and he hasn't established that yet. So you could say not everything's like that. And he hasn't asked us to believe yet that everything cannot be. In fact, all he's argued from so far is that some things are like that. In fact, all he really needs is one thing to be like that for his argument to work. You could have a world that's full of necessary things. You just need one contingent thing for this argument so far to work. Okay, so notice he's very, this argument's very modest. It's very parsimonious. He's not asking for much. He's just saying, you notice there's at least some things that generate and corrupt, like the daisies in your yard. That's enough to get this argument going. So he doesn't need everything to be that way. He just needs something to be that way. Okay, so he begins to work this through. And he actually acknowledges that not everything in nature is this way. So we know that there are some things that generate and corrupt. And we know that not everything can be that way, because otherwise there'd be nothing. And we know that there is something. We have a world around us. So that concludes, in your point exactly, that the existence of the things around us tells us there's got to be more than merely contingent things, right? There have to be some necessities. And you might think, well, there it is, that's the God argument. But no, not for Thomas. He says there are some necessary things in nature. So that's just the first stage. He first delivers the point that things that could be or not be only are explained by things that can't not be. That is, things that are necessary. But he doesn't think that's gotten us God yet. Because he says, in the natural world, there are certain necessities. So Thomas takes science really seriously. That's a way to look at this, right? He doesn't squash the natural world down in order to make room for God the Creator. He's taking seriously the integrity of the created order and the fact that within the created order, there's real necessity in nature. Now, his cosmology has some mistakes. He doesn't have access to the kinds of scientific insights that we have. He thinks, and maybe not totally erroneously, but he thinks some of the necessary features of the universe are the motions of the heavenly bodies, the planetary movements. And that's not entirely wrong, right? Just think of the difference that makes for life on Earth, our proximity to the sun, the change of the seasons, the gravitational pull of the moon, and all those kinds of things. That makes a huge difference on plants and animals, things that generate and corrupt. So he's not all completely off track there. But he's saying, you could explain the plants and animals that generate and corrupt just by pointing to something in nature, right? Like the laws of physics or the motions in the planetary bodies or something like that. Is that good enough? Someone might be tempted to say, especially in our day, yes, that's good enough. All we need are the laws of physics. All we need are the regularities of nature. That explains anything contingent in the world. And everything is determined by those laws or by those fixities or regularities. Thomas says, not so fast. We can actually get behind that. So we got contingent things. No contingent things exist without necessary ones. So we've got contingent things and necessary things. But then, stage 2 of the argument, which we haven't read yet, he goes on to say, there's necessity and then there's necessity. There's two kinds of necessity. And it's important to distinguish them because there are things that are necessary, but only necessary in a relative way. And then there's one thing that's absolutely necessary. And that's the maker, that's the creator, that's God. So what is at stake in this distinction between absolute necessity and relative necessity? I'll clarify that, then I'll take the break I promised you. because I'm going kind of slow. I apologize to you. And those of you that need to go can go. So the difference between absolute and relative necessity is this. Thomas distinguishes between essence and being. And these are some terms that I put on your glossary you can look at later. The essence of a thing is what it is, right? The existence of a thing is the act of being whereby it is. Now, it's funny to think of being as an act, but that's a fundamental principle. It's very hard to convince anybody about the existence of God if you can't get a straight notion of existence down to begin with, just ordinary existence. We think of running, jumping, hiking, studying, singing. Those are all actions. Those are all verbs. But we forget that being is an action. And in fact, our grammar teachers, our English teachers tell us that it isn't sometimes. My kids were doing some grammar recently, and one of the lessons had, the verb to be is not, it's one of those exceptional verbs that's not an action. Verbs are always action words, but being is not. No, you have to be a metaphysician. Being is the act of all acts, right? Being is act more than anything else is act. Why? Because you can't run, jump, sing, hike, read unless you are, right? So the most fundamental act that there is existence itself. It's very basic, right? It's very basic, but it's presupposed by anything else, and it is actuality because something that exists not is brought into actuality from that potency by the act of esse. Thomas calls it esse. It's literally the infinitive to be in Latin. It means existence. Okay, so existence is a key notion for the Catholic tradition, but for Thomas here in this argument. And here's what he's getting at. What a thing is doesn't include the act of its existence, right? You can describe very clearly what a thing is without ever getting clear on whether it is. Like I could, to use an example that a professor of mine once used with me, I could define to a T the state of affairs of me having a diamond ring in my pocket, right? And I could tell you exactly how many carats it is and how big it is and what it looks like and the dimensions and everything. But you could have an exact notion of what it would be for me to have that ring. I may or may not have it, right? You don't know if it's there until I turn my pockets out and see if it falls out onto the floor. You can have a complete description of the essence of an item or of a whole state of affairs, and it has everything you need, except it doesn't include existence. And in fact, if you think about anything in the world, anything that you experience, everything is like that. Everything in the world is the kind of thing that does not have actual existence written in to its very nature, right? So what Thomas's point is to be that kind of a thing is to be contingent. So even the necessary features of our world, the laws of physics, why the heavenly bodies are in motion, etc., the most permanent features of the world, even those permanent features of their very nature do not include existence. And so one can legitimately raise the question, why are they then? Maybe you could say, they always have been that way. Thomas could agree with you. He might say, maybe the world always was. Notice his arguments are not arguing to a beginning of the world. He's very modest. He's not expecting you to give any more than you have to without the Bible, without faith. He's not arguing to a beginning of the world in time. He's only arguing to the world's dependence on something outside of itself. So maybe, Thomas would even grant you, as the non-believer, maybe there always was a world. Even if so, you're not off the hook on the God question. You might have an eternal world, but what you can't have is an independent world. You might have a world that always was, and the laws of physics always were what they were, and everything was swinging around the way it, maybe that's true, he says, as a philosopher. About that. I wonder when that happened. I did turn it on at the beginning, so hopefully it worked. Okay, good. So Maura, my colleague, is here from the Graduate School. If anyone has questions about the program, I should have mentioned when the big group was here that she was there, and I just got carried away. And as Maura already knows, I can go on forever about these things, and I've probably already gone on too far. But let me try to take you as far as I can through the material, and at least the handouts will give you some direction if you want to read further on this on your own. So where did we leave off? We left off with this understanding of God as a necessary entity, he who is, he who cannot not be. And what we know about God is not only that he is, but we know a little bit about what he is too, okay? And what he is very elusive. We know that his nature, his essence, is simply to be, which is very bizarre, right? It's a very strange way of explaining what something is. Usually you say it's 5-sided and blue and it weighs 3 grams or something like that. And in God's case, right, the nature is to be, pure and simple. That's just what it is to be that resultant of the third way argument. The principle that accounts for why there is anything is that he's got to be that sort of a thing, right? A necessary being, one whose whatness is his thatness, if that makes sense, right? His nature and his existence are identical. So we have some insight now into the nature of God, but it remains elusive because we can't conceptualize what that would be like, since nothing in our experience is that kind of a thing, right? So we can understand that God is a being whose nature is his existence, but we don't know what that's like, right? And so God is transcendent, right? He's incomprehensible, but we do know that about him. And that tells us something very important about the world's relationship to him. It means that God has what it takes to be the creator. God can give being because he is being. So what I want to do next with you is sort of elaborate what creation is and what it isn't, and what that shows us about the relationship between the world and God. So sometimes we say God is simple. Has anybody ever heard of divine simplicity here? Okay. The stuff that we've just been unpacking gets at the doctrine of divine simplicity, which is ironic because it doesn't sound very simple. There's a book by Christopher Hughes called A Complex Theory of a Simple God, and it's all about Aquinas' teaching on the nature of God. So divine simplicity isn't necessarily simple to wrap your mind around at first, but there's a simple way of explaining what it is. And simplicity for St. Thomas just means non-composition. So when we say that God is simple, we mean he's not composite, or that he doesn't have parts. He doesn't have parts in any sense of the term. Obviously, he doesn't have a body, so he doesn't have physical parts. But he doesn't also have form and matter. He doesn't have, different components. When we get to the Trinity, right, the different members of the Godhead are not parts of God. I get that all the time in papers from my students. The Son is part of God. No, they're not part of God. They are God, right? The Father, Son, and Spirit all are God. They're not component parts that make up God. So God, pure and simple, has no parts. He's not composite. He's simple. And at the very core of this claim that God is simple, there are two related aspects that I want to touch on. One, we've talked about already in respect to the third way. God's being is identical with his nature. That's the most important point. The second is that God is identical with his nature. Those are different claims, but both of them are at the heart of divine simplicity. So one more time. The first claim is that God is his own nature. The second claim is that God's nature is his being. Okay? Now, what's at stake in the first claim? You and I are not our nature, right? So we're human. There's humanity, human nature. That makes us all like each other. We're all the same kind of thing. Just like all dogs are canine, right? But individual dogs don't exhaust all that it is to be canine. That's how you have multiple dogs. And they're differentiated from each other most obviously by different matter. They're materially different. The stuff in Fido is different than the stuff in Rex. And so Fido and Rex are numerically two different instances of dog, right? You and I are like that too. We have different bodies. Yeah.
Is that kind of like saying God's form
is God. Yeah. So the individual, God, the one who there is, right, is the same as his form. That's the first claim. So form, nature, essence, I'm using those words all this to mean the same thing. So, and that's different from us, right? Dogs and us, we have a common nature, but we are not identical with our nature, right? To be human is not the same thing as to be Dr. Matava, thankfully, right? There are different instantiations of human nature, but not so with certain other creatures, right? So it's true that in God, there is an identity of individual and nature, but there are some creatures that have that too. Angels. I don't want to diverge on angels, but angels are different, right? Each angel is identical with his nature. So, and why is this? They don't have bodies, right? They're not materially differentiated one from another. So each angel is its own species, right? At least on Aquinas' angelology. There's a lot we don't know about angels. I don't want to sidetrack too much. But angels are above us, right? They're more simple than we are, and God is simple in that way too. But even angels are created. And there's something distinctive about God, even over the angels. And that is not just the identity between God and his nature, or form, or essence, but the identity of God's essence with his being. That is at the very heart of divine simplicity. No angel is like that. Because if what you are is the same as that you are, then you are not contingent. You are not created. And there's only one that is that kind of a being. So divine simplicity encompasses both of those claims. God is his nature, which is his being. Okay. So that's what it means to say that God is simple. There's no contradiction. God is utterly distinct from